This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is grizzly bears, why they are keystone species, what their import is, and we'll be speaking with a guest about it. The subject is grizzly bears. Louisa Wilcox is my guest. As I usually like to do, I give people a few minutes to talk about who they are, what they do, and why they do it. So Louisa is one of the founders of the Grizzly Times. Louisa, welcome. And is this a scientific journal? Is this a more populist approach? And what was your aims in starting it?
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about an animal that I've been obsessed with, in love with for so many decades. It's really been it's defined my life. Grizzly Time, we started Grizzly Times. My husband and I started Grizzly Times. He is a retired federal large carnivore biologist, so studied grizzlies in Yellowstone in the field for several decades and went on to mountain lions and has been at the core of a lot of the policy and even more recently the litigation of grizzlies based on the science. I have 35 going on 40 years of conservation work. I've worked for Greater Yellowstone Coalition, Sierra Club, a group called Natural Resources Defense Council. I started an office for them here in Livingston, near Yellowstone, where I live. And so Grizzly Times is a combination of advocacy, science, and storytelling. Storytelling because of the power of the grizzly and the stories that we tell about grizzlies to ourselves really define whether they live or die, really define our relationship with them. And so most recently, we've been collecting stories from our readers about their experiences with bears, and they are hilarious. From an 11-year-old sending us a video about his experience to, old people who talk about their background here in Yellowstone or Glacier. Funny stories, touching stories, stories that make you cry. And I think that we lose track when we think these are just political debates about whether grizzly bears should be listed under the Endangered Species Act or not, or what the science is, what the threats are to climate change. We lose track of fundamentally our relationship with bears, how they relate to their ecosystems, and how their role defines the ecosystems and make the ecosystems healthy and whole, as in Yellowstone, and Yellowstone, of course, has all the species that were here when the Lewis and Clark expedition came across the country. Now that we have wolves back, that was the missing link. We never lost our grizzly bears, but grizzly bears are threatened. Well, I'm sure we'll get into a lot of that. But I don't know where you want to go now, Dan.
Well, the publication is called Grizzly Times, not Bear Times. So what is it
Yeah.
particularly about grizzlies rather than black bears or sloth bears or polar bears or Kodiak bears?
Right.
Grizzlies are part of brown bears, and so in a sense, Kodiaks are just sort of jacked up grizzlies in a sense. But
Yeah.
so what makes the grizzly the focus rather than bears as a whole?
Well, it's true that the black bear is the North American bear. It's the indigenous bear that was here. And the grizzly, if you want to call it that, it's kind of if you want to call it a newcomer, it kind of is, at least dating back 70,000 years. It came across the Siberian straits from Siberia and Europe, where the brown bears and grizzly bears are the same species, Ursus arctos. They're subspecies, if you want to call it that. Now they call them clades, genetic differences within brown bears. But the reason we focus on grizzlies is because they're so much more vulnerable than other bears in the lower 48 states, which is the black bear. That's our only other bear down here. When you get north into Alaska and Canada, that's where the polar bears are, which actually evolved from grizzlies, which we'll get into probably in a bit. And they are very threatened by climate change nowadays. But in the lower 48 states, what we have are grizzly bears. And the reason we focus on them is because they are the barometer of the health of the whole. And they are threatened, mostly by people. Humans kill 90% of the grizzly bears that die for a whole package of reasons. But a lot of it is rooted in fear and anxiety of an animal that indeed, can tear us into little bits. So the grizzly bears, its vulnerability and its important role in the ecosystem are why we decided to devote, basically our retirement years to trying to do what we can to make sure that grizzly bears are still here for, our grandkids and great grandkids.
Yeah, you bring up the fact that grizzlies are newcomers vis-a-vis black bears, rather. I remember as a child watching a Mutual of Omaha Wild Kingdom episode about, or it might have been a doubleheader. I think they did one on polar bears in Manitoba, Churchill, and then they did one on grizzly bears. And I don't know how much if maybe I'm outside your wheelhouse, but one of the things I found interesting in that show, and has stuck with me all these years, was that grizzlies and brown bears, as they came over the Beringia, the land bridge that was exposed, several times, it took several thousands of years for them to get settled and become acclimatized into North America, because
Right.
one of the native bears that was there was the short-faced bear, which, as far as we know, is the largest bear that ever was. And as much bigger as polar bears are than grizzlies, a short face is that much bigger than a polar. And it took, and one of the interesting things I found out that was claimed these 50 years ago on that show was that one of the reasons that grizzly bears are more feared than other bears is they had to get more aggressive to compete with the much larger short-faced bear, which went extinct probably because of early Native Americans or changes in climate back then. So what sets the grizzly apart, say, from polar bears or from the Kodiaks? Is it that they are more aggressive, or?
No, let me take this in stages about the how bears got here in their history. Grizzly bears were essentially blocked from North America by ice for ice age after ice age after ice age, and the history, the prehistory is huge amount of uncertainty. But it's thought that there may have been a first wave, and grizzly bears came here in waves. There would be an ice-free corridor open up in the interior of BC down to, through the Rockies, through the Rocky Mountain Trench in Canada, and then into the US. And down as far as Mexico, eventually. I mean, there were grizzlies in Mexico till the 1950s, believe it or not. And they would come in waves, and they're called clades. It's like a subspecies almost. And the bears we mostly have are called clade 4. And they came down, the second wave at least. There are the earliest remnant we have of an actual grizzly archaeological discovery is in central Alberta about 35,000 years ago. So that was the second wave. And there were more that came. And some stayed in the north and evolved into the polar bear. They're, basically a carnivorous diet. Grizzly bears here are omnivores. They eat pretty much everything we eat, from ants to buffalo and whitebark pine seeds. But the grizzly bears, because there isn't that much green growy stuff up in the north for many months, they evolved to eat seals and other marine mammals to basically survive. And so, but they're not very different from a grizzly bear in the sense that they evolved from it. So we're seeing now, as a result of climate change, that grizzly bears in Canada can move further and further north into Manitoba, which they're doing, further and further north, and occasionally interbreed with polar bears. And they become the growler, as you said, or pizzly, or people joke about it. Nobody really knows if these animals are going to be reproductively successful, but they could be. Yes, we're friends with some of the researchers who are working on this. It's a very interesting phenomena and raises questions about what is the future of the polar bear. If its habitat is no longer as available, first of all, numbers are shrinking, collapsing, and will we see kind of a hybridization, a larger band of hybridization of the polar bear? So, but in terms, shifting to your point about aggressiveness, grizzly bears aren't aggressive all the time. There's a difference in their behavior depending on where they are. And let me back up maybe for a second before I go into this. The grizzly bear omnivore pattern. They are very adaptable in some ways. When you think about Yellowstone, for example, they get up in the snow den at high elevation, maybe 8,000 feet in the snow. They make a beeline down to the lowest elevation, looking for any green, growy things, sedges, grasses, in the springtime, as well as winter-killed bison. And then as the summer progresses, they move. This is basically why they define the ecosystem. They move throughout the ecosystem. They move up in elevation, begin to eat biscuit root, then yampa as the season progresses, berries, during the rut, big game rut, they'll take out injured bull elk that, gotten injured warring with other bull elk. And so you have a bear covering hundreds of square miles down in Yellowstone, and their home ranges are even larger in the north, in the boreal. To make a living, get fat enough, because it's a battle against, battle for calories, a battle against winter. To get enough fat, they have to be obese to make it for 4 months without eating, drinking, or defecating. Mother goes in a little hole in the ground, sits there, and has cubs, and has to nurse them in the den for several months. So she has to be in really good shape. That's why they have so few cubs, because they can't support it. Then they get out of the den. So you have in Yellowstone large home ranges. In coastal British Columbia, the home ranges are quite small. Why? Because they have salmon runs, highly concentrated fish sources, highly concentrated berry patches, and bears up there, just as bears and Native Americans for millennia did the same, work cheek by jowl along these salmon streams to gorge on salmon and berries in a fairly small area. And those bears in coastal Alaska and British Columbia are fairly, I wouldn't say docile, but when you look at films, if you look at Brooks Falls and some of the bear viewing areas, these bears are not aggressive. These bears are socialized with each other. People are getting really close to them. Not that that's a good idea to walk up to one, but they're fairly tolerant because of the food source. The food source is so great that they want to stay there unless a mother with cubs is really disturbed by the presence of another male or a person or something. So the bear behavior really depends on where it is. The most sketchy bears, in terms of like willingness to run or willingness to react, are the ones in the very far north, in the tundra. And their home ranges are huge, and their calories are really spread out. And they'll scare at a very long distance. And also you surprise one and they feel threatened. So your point about aggression, it really depends on where the bear is. It also depends, bears are a lot like us. I mean, that's why there are all these stories of the woman who married a bear. That's perhaps the oldest story that we know of, probably 25,000 years, told throughout the Northern Hemisphere, from Siberia to Greece, about a woman who married a bear. Because bears are so much like us. They nurture their young for several years fiercely, as, mother bears, like our mothers hopefully did. They eat the same things. They stand up on their hind legs. They're really smart. They're problem solvers. You can watch a bear, solving a problem, digging out pocket gophers, or solving a problem, getting across the stream. You can see the intelligence, and that makes for a unique relationship, and a certain amount of tolerance on the part of a bear if somebody is calm around them.
That might,
bears and dogs are descended from the same bear dog in ancient. So, think dog. They're smart. Depending on if you're afraid of the dog, you feel like it's being aggressive. You're gonna convey that emotion, and the animal's gonna get it. And so, one thing about being in the field in bear country is it's important to control your fear, and sing and be as calm as you possibly can, because you're communicating. That if you have an encounter with an animal, you're communicating with that, and that may affect the result. I would say further in this point of aggression, there's this really interesting phenomenon happening in Yellowstone, but also in Grand Teton Park right now, where female grizzlies, thought to be the most aggressive, right? Defending their cubs. are living by the roadsides where there are thousands and thousands of people traveling into the park with their cubs, navigating in this. There's one very famous bear called 399. She's sort of this icon bear, and she had quadruplets a few years ago. She's just a rock star celebrity. Well, she looks both ways when she crosses the road. I mean, she's very savvy to people. And so she has decided, as other females, to make a living next to the road because male bears sometimes eat cubs. And she is willing to take a gamble on us, take a gamble that we will be calm and respectful and not, invade her space because she's trying to avoid male bears. And so people get, I mean, accidentally, but get very, very close to her. And she acts like, a mother with muffins in the oven most of the time. That's not to say she's not a grizzly bear. And if somebody really gets in her face or tries to get at her cub, all hell will break loose. But bears' tolerance for people varies hugely. And her choices sort of demonstrate how far it can go, if people are respectful.
That might explain why polar bears, since they have the least exposure to humans, are probably the most aggressive because they have the least experience with them.
Well, um, they are and they aren't the most aggressive. I mean, they too can be extremely tolerant. Around Churchill, some of those bears that get to be buddies with huskies, that are up there and, hang around people's house. I mean, the same phenomenon occurs with all bears, where some bears, it's called habituation. They get used to people. And sometimes that makes them dangerous, and sometimes it actually makes them safer because, as in 399, she knows the drill. But it's generally, the big thing is not to feed bears, any kind of bear, because once they get conditioned to the food and they get serious about finding it, if it's in your cooler or in your house, that's a problem. But this conditioning thing, it's not all bad. It's painted to be bad, but it isn't.
So 35,000 or so years is a blink of an eye geologically for polar bears to have evolved from grizzly bears. And like I said, they're, 25 to 40% larger than grizzlies. They've got, the white is actually colorless. And so that's quite a bit of, you don't think of such at least big physical changes occurring. And you mentioned about whether they were sterile or not. They've crossbred tigers and lions. They get ligers or tigons, which are
Yeah.
apparently sterile like mules. But
Hmm.
that's there's a far longer distance. There's several million years, I think, between when
Yeah.
tigers and lions split off. So it would seem to me that growlers and pisleys probably could become a species and reproduce.
Yeah, well, we will certainly see. And polar bears split off. As I said, there were different waves of the brown bear that came across, and the polar bear is thought to have split off more 100+ thousand years ago. So it's not they weren't part of the most recent wave that came down and colonized North America. Um, but the Yeah, but it's true. They were very closely related. I mean, it helps if you're an Arctic animal, like the woolly mammoths. If you're an Arctic animal, to be big, because you've got more, you've got more bulk, less, exposure of your limbs, to protect you. Even human morphology changed with the Inuits are kind of stocky or shape. It helps if you're dealing in a very, very cold environment for the grizzly, for the polar bear to have gotten to the size that it did.
So you mentioned about wolves, and they were famously killed off in the Yellowstone area and then reintroduced as white Europeans moved westward. Were they more? I guess black bears, since they're less aggressive and not as strong, not as big as grizzly bears, was encountering grizzlies something that triggered off in human beings that we've got to get rid of them if we're going to keep moving westward. Was it? I mean, it wasn't to the extent that bison, where you'd see the pyramids of skulls of bison being stacked up. But what was the difference between how Europeans, as they pushed across the continent, treated black bears versus grizzlies, and why? And
Oh,
were black bears ever endangered?
There are population of black bears that are endangered. There's a very tiny population in Louisiana that lives in the deciduous swamps there that is, unique. So but for the most part, the reason black bears made it is that they were more reproductively successful, and what they're doing now is, you have black bears in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. They've been able to recolonize as the forests have regrown. They're much more dependent on forest ecosystems than grizzlies that can actually live in the plains and live in various different kinds of habitat. Grizzlies never made it to the East Coast. Well, that's not true. A few grizzlies in a very weird situation following the melting glaciers made it to Newfoundland.
Yeah. I was going to say, I thought the maritime provinces had grizzlies at one point.
Well, the Newfoundland was the big one that had it, and then they were exterminated. Wasn't that big a population, but for what grizzlies were thwarted, sort of in the middle of the country, by the abundance of black bears. So they're competitors in part, like the dominant carnivore in the Cascades now is the black bear, because grizzly bears are no longer. So the black bear is the big kid on the block. So in ecosystems where grizzly bears are gone, black bear assumes dominance, but they never got east, which probably speaks to time. If there were enough grizzlies for enough time putting pressure on black bears, and because they are aggressive with black bears, grizzlies can be, they displace them, and they can even kill them. But they would have almost certainly, there's enough food, there's great food, beech forests and the like, for grizzly bears, much like in Europe, on the East Coast. They just didn't get that far. But as far as the frontier mentality, the manifest destiny mentality was aggressive across the board with all large carnivores, anything that they thought would stand in the way of progress and settlement. They brought a fundamentally different ethos. They supplanted the ethos of the Native Americans that never hunted grizzly bears, except for in the very North Boreal. They never did, because of their reverence for the bear and their view of the bear as a guide, as a healer, as a mentor. So trophy hunting was not a deal. They occasionally hunted them for, claws and necklaces and symbolic, spiritual practice, but they didn't hunt them, which plays out recently in the political, we can get into that later, but there was a uniform anti-carnivore ethos, that was the frontier mentality. Some animals were able to reproduce their way out of the problem, or had habits that hid them from people enough that they didn't go extinct. The mountain lion is a good one. Mountain lions can be very, very aggressive, but they're hugely stealthy, and they climb trees. And so, despite the best efforts of frontiers people, they never were able to wipe out the mountain lion, and they never were able to wipe out the black bear. It wasn't that they didn't try. It was that black bears are more fecund, they're more reproductively successful. They can, live in dense forests that are more away from people, whereas grizzlies are pretty obvious. And if you have a salmon run, the bears are going to be very easy to wipe out, because they're all going to be concentrated. All you have to do is go down with a high-powered rifle next to a salmon stream, and you get a huge bunch of the population. So wolves and grizzlies were particularly vulnerable because of poison. There's a lot of poisoning, trapping, and in the case of grizzlies, their reproductive rates are so low. They're the lowest reproductive animal in North America. So a female, it goes like this. A female gets reproductively of age when she's like 5. And then every 2 to 3 years, she has cubs, which mostly are 1 or 2. Sometimes you get 3. Sometimes, in extraordinary circumstances, you get 4. You tend to have larger litters where there's more food, like up in the salmon ecosystems of British Columbia. But anyway, and your lifespan is in the wild 20, if you're lucky. So a female in this ecosystem is lucky to replace herself in the population. And so with that kind of low reproductive rate, it doesn't take too many effective, sharpshooters to wipe out the grizzly bear population, or poisons. It was a huge way that they killed them. it didn't take long. In the case of grizzly bears, it took 6 years to drive what was thought to be 75,000 grizzly bears, from Canada, to Mexico, from the plains to the coast, down to about maybe 1,500, 1,800 by the 1920s. It took the blink of an eye, to wipe them out. And that's why, for the same reasons, that's why we're fighting about grizzly bears today, because they cannot reproduce their way out of a problem. And it doesn't take very many hostile people with guns and bad attitudes, to drive the population back. It just doesn't. We've made progress under the Endangered Species Act, but because of their inherent biology, they're extremely vulnerable.
So it's the females that can't reproduce as quickly, or do males predate on the cubs more often?
The whole thing is driven by females. Hate to say it, guys, but the ecosystem is driven by reproductively successful females, and it doesn't take anyway. Males are vitally important, of course, but it's the limiting factor is females, and that's why the counting methods for Yellowstone grizzly bear population relies on females with cubs, successful females, and males do predate on cubs, and the reason they do is thought is to get that female to go back into estrus, which she will, and then they can breed with her. So that's not unlike other carnivores do the same thing. It doesn't happen as much as you think it might. It actually doesn't. But the psychology of females is, and their whole behavior around food sources, if there's a male bear, she is wary. And if she's got cubs and she's with a male bear, she sees a male bear, she's going to be wary. And so less likely to eat a winter-killed carcass, highly concentrated food source. If there's male bears around, she'll choose often roots or other foods. That's changing now with climate change, and I'm sure we'll get into climate change. But they're trying to stay away from male bears, and that's why females like 399 are willing to roll the dice on humankind and try to make it with us, because she's so freaked out about males.
So let me just ask you, how do you define a keystone species, and what makes a grizzly bear a keystone species?
A keystone species, you can also called umbrella species, indicates by the habitat that they use, foraging behavior, denning behavior, basically the area that they use, the health of the broader whole. So you have elk, you have other species that use the same habitat, but the grizzly bear in Yellowstone is considered keystone because it's the top of the food chain. And you often, if you protect the large predators, because of their reliance on game and other species, pocket gophers, and all the way down to trout, all the way down the food chain, you protect everything. So keystone indicates you're the top of the heap, and by what you use, you embrace the integrity of the whole. In the case of grizzly bears, that was first made clear. It was clear to a lot of people before, but it was first made clear biologically by a very famous set of twins, Frank and John Craighead, who were working in Yellowstone in the 1950s and 60s. They were on all the National Geographic specials, and they were very delightful. They invented the first radio collars and had the dark bears. It was kind of cowboy biology in a certain way, but they learned a ton, and they concluded they were the first ones to call Yellowstone, centered on Yellowstone Park, Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, defined because it was a keystone species that defined in terms in the form of an ecosystem, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. And that, so we talk about the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem is centered on glacier. The Cabinet-Yaak ecosystem, where grizzly bears are, not very many, but is centered on northwest Montana and a little mountain range. So the grizzly bears, by the habitat they rely on and the importance of, going down to low elevations and up to high elevations in the fall, they're using the whole enchilada, and they're always testing out what foods. And they're relying on elk and everything else. So what the craighead said is, you protect grizzly bears, you've got the whole thing.
So I know, like as mentioned with reintroduction of wolves, from what I've gathered about that is when wolves were gone, there weren't the top predators. Uh, the different deer populations got out of hand. They ate too much of the foliage, which then some river systems were not shaded. This kept out creatures like
Mm-hmm.
beavers. And so basically everything is a domino collapse kind of thing. What happened? What would happen if grizzly bears are gone? What dominoes would fall and why?
You know, that's an interesting question. And the point is that we don't know if any dominoes would fall. And the reason for that is because of the variety of foods that grizzly bears eat. And if one food is down one year, they'll shift to another. Whereas wolves are big game dependent. And that is so when wolves were gone from the ecosystem, which they were for 60 years, you had elk numbers huge. And but this didn't happen just in Yellowstone, where wolves are gone throughout the West. This happened, in ecosystems in the Southwest and across the West. You had big game starving because the top predators, they just exploded and the top predators were gone. To keep those herds healthy, you needed to have a top carnivore that were effectively predating. Now, grizzly bears do eat elk, and they eat mostly in the form of elk calves in the spring. They're eating a lot of elk calves now. But yeah, the thing is, we wouldn't likely see a cascade if grizzly bears were to evaporate from the ecosystem. But the point is that having them here means that the ecosystem is healthy. And also having them here in a non-biological, from a non-biological perspective, means that we have come to terms with our aggressive, hostile frontier past. We are willing to let a large carnivore that can be aggressive and indeed can kill us, we're willing to let those animals live on the landscape. So it's a moral victory if we have grizzly bears and wolves, as well as a biological one. That what the Endangered Species Act did for grizzlies is it represented a different ethos from the frontier mentality. It basically said, we went too far, in an effort to dominate this planet. And we have a moral duty to recover these species. And so the grizzly bear has been protected since 1975 under the Endangered Species Act. And but for that law, we would probably not have grizzly bears in northwest Montana and the Cabinet Yaak. We would have a hunkered down few hundred animals inside the bounds of Yellowstone Park where bears are not hunted, and a small population in Glacier, and that's it. Maybe 600 grizzly bears out of a former population of 75,000. That's what we would have had without the Endangered Species Act. What the Endangered Species Act did, it stopped hunting outside the park. It curbed poaching. It hasn't stopped poaching, but because the sentences can be very high, tens of thousands of dollars if you're convicted, it gave some people who otherwise might poach, and there was a huge poaching problem here, pause in terms of, not killing more. It started a program on the public lands related to storing food properly. This is, of course, a big issue with black bears. Keeping food out of the reach of grizzly bears' paws, because food conditioned bears often are killed because they become dangerous to people. So huge food storage program, huge educational program about coexisting with bears inside the parks. So all of these things help turn the situation around. One more thing that was really valuable was the science-driven limitation on the number of roads you could have on the landscape. Not closing off access entirely, but limiting the density of roads, essentially. It became very important, especially on national forest lands. So with all of that, grizzly bear numbers began to rebound starting in the early 1990s. The population, using new methods, is considered about 900 bears, but the there's a good chance that the population is declining now, for reasons related to climate change, human hostility, kind of the cultural, a culture of revenge, I would say, revenge killing, that seems to be going on. It seems to be increasing.
Revenge
And the
killing
hostility.
for what? For bears that attacked a human?
No, well, those bears are killed. I mean, if a bear attacks a human or kills somebody, especially if they kill somebody, they're considered, you know, beyond pale. I mean, one could argue that a female protecting her cubs who knocks somebody down and kills them maybe shouldn't be killed. I would argue that, but the policy is, and we're not making a big fuss about it, a person killed by a bear, that bear will die. Often, the same thing happens with maulings. No, what I'm talking about is a change in human culture and their attitudes in the West, where grizzly bears and wolves are seen as a changing ethos. People moving to Yellowstone, Glacier, the Intermountain West to raise their kids in a safe environment and have wild nature. And they can be more liberal, if you will. They often represent stereotypes that the traditional rancher hunter culture feels threatened by. So you've got increasingly a clash of cultures going on in the West. And so if grizzly bears and wolves too, there's revenge killing of wolves in spades, where these animals haven't done anything, but they represent an ethos. It's not legal to kill those people, but it's legal in some cases to kill a wolf. And I had somebody actually tell me that one time. I was at a hearing on wolves and Cody, and it was a really hostile hearing. I mean, a lot of people yelling and screaming. And afterwards, a guy walked up to me in a cowboy hat, West Livingston, his name was, and he said, "I want to talk to you," because I testified. And he said, "I don't hate bears, but we can't control beef prices. We can't control the weather. We can't control what the banks do in terms of loaning money to us. But all of us have a gun and we can go out and kill ourselves a wolf." That was an eye opener to me. But I've seen it elsewhere. I've heard it, and so we're up against that. And
Well, we shouldn't be surprised about that. If you just look at Palestine and Israel, I mean, people kill each other in revenge killings all the time. So what?
Yeah.
If people have disregard for human beings, they're not going to regard wolves or bears.
Exactly. But also, if these animals are symbolically laden, if they're identified with a certain assumption about people's political orientation, they're loaded. The animal itself. This is not true of black bears, by the way. Black bears, because they were never listed under the Endangered Species Act. There was never litigation really in the West over black bear issues. Well, there has been. I shouldn't say that. Not never, but it's very rare. The black bears are sort of in the water sublime. And it's like, yeah, they're black bears, but they also don't attack people nearly as much. Although, truth be told, in Canada, the biggest predator on people are black bears, just because there's so many black bears. Not.
But when we say predators, what are we talking? A handful of people, or?
Oh no! I mean, many hundreds of people in Canada. There's a huge density of black bears. I mean, this is over decades. It's not like it happens every year, but you have enough black bears. You have enough black bears that get food conditioned, become dangerous, and you've got a lot of people, a lot of bears, and you have dangerous situations. Whereas there are just so many fewer grizzly bears in Canada and here. Sorry.
Okay, because the reason I ask is what was once called the Jaws effect. You saw the movie Jaws 50 years ago, and people were like thinking hundreds of people were being killed by great whites, whereas worldwide I think it was only a couple of dozen, and usually those were surfer boys. But you mentioned the
same is true with grizzly bears. The same is true. Highly publicized deaths.
Yeah. You mentioned poaching. Now, grizzly bears don't have rhino horns that supposedly have aphrodisiac qualities. They don't have tusks. So is it just a macho thing to put a grizzly bear head on the wall?
Well, yes, or paws or hide. You've got the trophy factor. it's a big deal. They're a big deal. And it is a macho thing. And I won't go into what I think it represents, but a manhood. Women aren't doing this. They aren't killing these animals, or poaching. It's a guy thing, relative to poaching animals with big horns or poaching big trophies. Because therefore, I'm a bigger person or something. There's that, but also there's gallbladder. A gallbladder of bears is used in Chinese medicine. Yeah, and so there was a
it seems the
recent.
Chinese have an excuse to kill want to kill any large animal. I mean, whether it's penis enlargement or whatever.
Yes, it's actually there's grizzly bears are actually produce several chemicals that make for the imitation of one of these chemicals that grizzly bears have is used in diabetes treatment. So it's true that grizzly bears have medicinal value, but not true what the Chinese are doing or think they're doing in terms of stealing gall. But there was a grizzly bear killed not too long ago, and by the road it was left, and what was missing? The head, the paws, and the gall.
Mm. So
It's a deal.
So let's talk a little bit, a bit more though, because not all of the anti-grizzly bear sentiment comes down to machismo. So I want to talk about sort of media portrayals. About 20 years ago, there was that film by Werner Herzog called Grizzly Man about. And I'll just say the guy was an idiot, and he ended up getting himself and his girlfriend killed. And did that have any kind of a backlash media in terms of the way grizzlies were perceived in the public? I mean, it wasn't a huge film, blockbuster, but it did get some note.
Yeah, Dan, that is a super interesting question that a lot of us have been pondering. Timothy was a friend of mine, the guy who got killed.
Nothing personal.
No. I get it. He was also a head case. It's possible to be both. And what was missing in Herzog's film, Herzog interviewed from the film and didn't use it because I wasn't consistent with his message of his Germanic message of, violent, dark, murderous nature. That was his story. And Timothy really had a light side he was an incredible teacher, and I used to get him in schools around Greater Yellowstone, just kids. And my rule with Timothy was, you will have no picture of you and the bear in the same frame. He could get away for many years, for 14 years, what he did in Alaska, because that was a salmon population. Those bears were much more tolerant of people. Whereas you try to do what he tried to do down here, for all the reasons we've discussed, it wouldn't work. These bears are more aggressive. I mean, it would not have been possible. He knew something about bears. He just used his camera as a diary and pushed the limits. There were many of us who told Timothy, you need electric fence around your tent. You need to carry bear spray. If you go, because he was a high profile figure before he died. I mean, his photos were incredible. I mean, because of his connection with them. You really need to. And so there was a conversation among a lot of us who knew Timothy well, who could see this coming, who felt terrible that, he just wouldn't listen to a lot of us, that it's not just about you dying. In this case, it was about his girlfriend dying too. It was about the larger message. Now, a lot of us sort of strapped in and braced for huge backlash against bears, where Timothy was in Katmai. The Park Service was really freaked out that there would be Timothy wannabes up there, and they would try to do the same thing, and they'd also get killed, so they were braced. And it got a lot of heat and excitement in the media for a while, and it didn't really have an effect. Everybody, when you get into a grizzly bear conversation, and this is my world, Timothy comes up. But I've actually thought about trying to put an anthology about the meaning of Timothy Treadwell 23 years later, because it's been 23, because I don't think his death made that big of a blip. And I think everybody who knew anything about Herzog said, it's a Herzog film.
Yeah.
This is what nature is. This is how he portrays it, which is, a dark, violent vision.
Yeah, I know.
Um,
When I've talked to some people in Alaska, and the two names that come up are Treadwell and that Chris McCandless kid who died in the bus.
yeah.
And people say, why do we get them? And yet, well, having watched PBS as a kid, well, when I was a younger man, Alaskans, I'm more proud of someone like Dick Proenneke. I don't know if you ever heard of Richard
Yeah,
Proenneke.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So, but anyway, that aside,
But
what?
I
Oh,
don't think it's affected general attitudes toward bears,
okay.
or maybe a few people in cities whose only orientation is that film.
Hmm.
But you're seeing so many pictures of bears, like the 399, this Jackson rock star bear, and pictures of her with people, kids in cars, and the stories of all of that. I think that's more current and more powerful.
Hmm.
And the message is, if you behave respectfully, you and bears will be just fine. Yeah.
So, what is delisting, and why is it important to not delist
Yeah.
grizzlies?
So, as I said, grizzly bears have been protected under the Endangered Species Act for decades, over four. And they benefited from those protections. And the problem is not just that those protections are going to be potentially removed, and this time it'll be for the third time. The federal government has attempted this, stopped in court several times before. The problem is what happens after. And this gets into the states of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, which is where our grizzly bears are.
Mhm.
A few are in Washington state, but anyway. But the problem of delisting, it's centered around Yellowstone, which includes part of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And the attitude of these states, it's a little bit complicated. The attitude of these states is that they want to reduce the size of the population. They made that clear in their state plans. The state of Wyoming, where these rockstar bears are in Grand Teton, has made it very clear that they do not like the roadside grizzly bear situation. They do not intend to manage it. And while the Park Service can do what they want in Grand Teton Park, those bears use lands outside the park, and they will be gunned down. They will not make it. And third, the states want to open up hunting season, a trophy hunting season. And hunting was one of the reasons that the grizzly bears wound up on the endangered species list. Now, you can ask why. So you have, every time there's a poll, there's been many polls on the Endangered Species Act nationally. There's been many polls on grizzly bears, and people support the grizzly bears. There is enormous support every time. I've been around this issue for 40 years, and every time there's a comment period open about this question of should we remove endangered species protections or delist, the answer is no. Not just no, but like 80-90% people say no, nationally. Well, then you ask, what's the disconnect between what the states are up to and their view and the national? Because this is a nationally important species. People drive all over the country and travel from all over the world to see these animals.
Well, I mean,
Well,
other than the bald eagle, the grizzly might very well be the national symbol. I think what didn't one of the founding fathers want the grizzly as the maybe it was the black bear.
No, I think it was a turkey. I think Ben Franklin would be the turkey, which is appropriate. Yeah, they wouldn't have had to. Only Jefferson learned that there were, grizzlies when he sent Lewis and Clark out to document the West. Where was I? Oh, the states. Yeah. So you can ask why. What's this difference between the ethos of the national public every time you ask them, and the ethos of the state agencies? And I would say, I'm not talking about the citizenry of these states, I'm talking about the agencies that manage them. So it turns out that the state wildlife management system, created in the 1920s, in the wake of market hunting collapse of wildlife across the West, there was just huge commercial and other killing going on. These state agencies were created to conserve wildlife, but they have been fiscally dependent almost entirely on hunting dollars, either taxes from the sale of guns and ammunition or the sale of license fees. So hunters and the hunting culture has dominated management. This is not true in a few states. Well, it's true in all states. Some states, oddball states like Missouri and Florida, have gotten other funding into the state wildlife management system, federal funding, that has broadened the focus of the states beyond what you can kill. Florida's done it with helped a lot of money for restoration of the Everglades, for example. So, but the states of Montana and Idaho and Wyoming are as close as you get, and I'm not overstating this, to the old ethos of manifest destiny when it comes to large carnivores. And their narrative is that wolves and bears, grizzly bears, predate on big game. Our constituency want as many big game species, elk, deer, etc., as humanly possible. The fewer large carnivores we have from our perspective, the more hunters can kill them. So it's not just, it's turned into, it has become not just a fiscal dependency issue with hunters, it's a cultural connection with hunters, because where do these people go to school? They go to school at state ag universities that teach them hunting uber alles, ranching uber alles. Yeah. So you don't have people going into the states interested in bluebird conservation, or, you know, there is a fair amount of money that goes to the states from the endangered species recovery efforts. Federal money goes to the states, but it's a pittance compared to the money they get from hunter-related dollars, either directly from licenses or taxes.
So it's more money. It's more money in machismo, basically.
Yeah, and it's more than that. It's the culture that sees the world as increasingly anti-hunting. I think there is increasingly anti-trophy hunting sentiment for sure.
Do they want to at least maintain a breeding population within their states of these, or if they get their way, will the breeding population go and then there'll just be a collapse?
Yeah, they want to reduce as much as they can the size of the populations around the national parks where there will be no hunting. And the national parks are really important in this because they are preservation oriented. They are the gold star of management of grizzly bears, by the way. I mean, grizzly bears don't die in the parks. I mean, they really don't. They die everywhere else on federal land or private land as a result of conflicts, which is where the states will have control. No, their narrative is they don't want to see grizzly bears go off the landscape. They just want the numbers to be smaller. Now, the problem with that is twofold. One, these populations are isolated. They have been isolated. You have 5 islands isolated basically since the 1950s. All the scientists, including inside the federal government, say isolation genetically is a threat because you get a certain amount of inbreeding and it's not healthy. Scientists starting in the 1990s began to talk about 2 things that have become really salient in this debate about delisting. One, we need more bears in more places, and we need to reconnect these populations. Yellowstone to Glacier, Yellowstone to central Idaho, where there's beginning to be a grizzly bears recolonizing that enormous ecosystem in Idaho. The habitat is still there. Scientists were saying instead of considering recovery at 1,500 animals, we should be considering recovery at 8,000 animals, and there's a habitat to do that. Connected to Canada, connected to the Canadian Rockies, where there's more, robust populations as you go further north. That's the vision for recovery. What delisting would do is anchor the populations as to where in the postage stamps where they are. Mm-hmm. The other thing that the scientists have been saying and why delisting is a problem is climate change. Grizzly bears, it turns out, are very sensitive to climate change. And there's some really good examples in the last 20 years of how this has played out. Scientists were flagging this in the early 1990s. The recovery plan that is the current one, the one that still is extant, legal, said the word climate change about 2 or 3 times. We didn't know in the early 90s what climate change, how serious it was going to be and how serious it's become. So this recovery plan that delisting is tier 2 is obsolete. And here's one example of what climate change has done. In Yellowstone, there were 4 key food sources, high-calorie food sources in the form of trout, in the form of big game, in the form of army cutworm moths, and in the form of whitebark pine, a high-elevation pine with a seed like the pinon, like pine nuts that you get at the grocery store. Big, fat seeds, critical for females to fatten up before winter. And the fatter a female is, the more cubs she's going to produce. Squirrels do the convenient thing because the cones are high in the tree, and the squirrels clip the cones off, create big mittens, and the grizzly bears are dialed into squirrel chatter, and they dial into these mittens. And there's like 40,000 calories, and there's immense high-fat content in those mittens. Well, what happened was, this is the high elevation tree. This is the tree line species tree. It's related to bristlecone. It's in that family. They get thousands of years old. Yeah. And we have these huge, beautiful forests. Well, starting in the early 2000s, climate change drove a native pest, a native beetle, the mountain pine beetle. I shouldn't call it a pest. It's part of the ecosystem. It drove a native beetle up in elevation because of warming winters. And for the first time in history, prehistory, these native beetles were able to get into whitebark pine, a tree that had a chemical attractant for these beetles and that the tree had no protection against. And in the space of about 6 years in Yellowstone, 80% of whitebark pine died from this mountain pine beetle attack, which is basically climate change. What did bears do? I mean, they had this high elevation tree that was in wilderness, far from people, in their feeding frenzy period, hyperphagia in the fall. Where were they going to go? They were going to go down in elevation and go after the next big calorie items. This gets to the intelligence of the grizzly bear. And what did they do? They dialed into hunters, big game hunters in the fall hunting season. And they listened to the gunshot, and then they came in. This is in the backcountry, remote wilderness, big game hunters, and they're on this elk carcass, just as the hunter is on this elk carcass trying to dress it out. This is how bears are dying now. We talked about revenge killing. This is a lot of what happens, is accidental, encounters over high food resources, high food for people, high productivity food for people, and the same for bears. And they're dialed into hunters in a way that they were not before when they had whitebark pine. And so far this year, for example, hunters have killed 13 grizzly bears. The details, because they're all under investigation, are not clear, but typically it's either surprise encounters with hunters or conflicts over dead carcasses or injured animals that are trailing blood, and the grizzly bear smells it and the hunter's trying to find it.
So we talked just briefly here about the negative consequences of global warming. In doing a series of these shows, some animals like beavers with water retention are a key ally in the, mitigating some of the worst damages done by global warming. Prairie dogs with their turning of the soil and that kind of thing. Do bears actually, grizzly bears, do they actually have a positive effect that if they were gone would be worsened?
Yeah. I should mention this. There's one really clear example of this, and that is in coastal Alaska and British Columbia, as well as Kamchatka and coastal parts of Russia. On these salmon streams, when grizzly bears are eating a lot of salmon, what they will do is they will drag salmon, they'll eat some of it in the stream, and they'll drag a bunch, several hundred feet from the stream, uphill. And there's a lot, and they're basically fertilizing the soil. They're putting a lot of nitrogen into the system. So there's been a lot of work that scientists have found that grizzly bears provide a buffer zone of highly fertile soil by sort of spreading, the salmon remains around. And that would be lost. That's the clearest example. In Glacier, there's examples also of grizzly bears rototilling the soil and essentially gardening for glacier lilies and expanding glacier lily patches. Now you can argue, but that's a kind of a small scale situation compared to coastal Alaska and stuff.
So,
But they would have an effect if they were gone.
so looking out to the middle of the century, the end of this century, um, what do you see? Do you think that as climate change gets worse, will the preservation of bears and other endangered species, will that get a renewed focus with the in the mass media with the public, or do you think that it's going to be just constant battling?
Well, I think it's going to be constant battling, at least in the short term. In the longer term, there's a conversation. People care about grizzly bears. And who doesn't, what kid doesn't have a teddy bear? I mean, there is something about these animals that is magical and mysterious, and people care. And I think the disconnect between the ethos of the national public and what the states are doing is untenable over the long term. What the Endangered Species Act did was it gave citizens from across the country a voice in their management. This is why it's been a national debate on delisting. In the long term, I think that there is beginning to be a push to say, no matter what the legal status under the Endangered Species Act of grizzly bears, wolves, bison, even other species, they are species of national importance because of their keystone role, as you mentioned, because of their integrity in the ecosystem, and they deserve a national protection approach. However, and people are talking about how to frame that in terms of science, in terms of citizen involvement, because people across the country do care. How do you connect citizens to decision making in a better way than is being done now? So I think in the long run we're gonna continue to see the push for a federal approach, but grizzly bears die because of local situations. What is driving the debate now is the mortality rates are unsustainable. We are killing too many bears from avoidable causes, whether it's revenge killing, and in those cases, we need to prosecute the killers. In terms of accidental situations with hunters, we need to do better in terms of educating hunters about what to do, how to avoid problems. There are definitely situations that are avoidable. There's an increased problem with depredation of cattle by grizzlies. Grizzlies are turning to cows again, which they didn't used to 20 years ago. It was very rare to hear of that. But they're doing it now because of climate change and because of the loss of whitebark pine and trout. So on that front, how can we help ranchers coexist with grizzly bears? How do we help communities coexist with grizzly bears? So part of that federal approach has got to be more money, and not just for grizzly bears, for wolves. Wolves are getting tangled up with ranchers and depredations as well. And there are not enough resources focused to help people who want to do the right thing do the right thing. So I think the action is reducing mortality, improving how we coexist with these animals, and making an example out of the people who just are poaching for whatever reasons. That is not okay. And so I think the future, we know what we need to do. I mean, the question is, do we have the political will? Do we have the fortitude to get beyond, these skirmishes and these battles over to delisting to a broader vision? That's the key question.
Since you've been doing this for 3 decades or more, are younger people coming into this field? Are they more attuned, or are younger people in general? Where, if you're doing political battles in state houses in the upper west, there, are younger people more sympathetic to it? Do you think that overall, I mean, do you see a lessening of this manifest destiny kind of attitude in some of these states? Because what does it take? Because you look at, for example, we have
Yeah.
a record hurricane season. You can't really. A lot of these people who are pro killing grizzlies and other stuff, they're global warming denialists in a sense.
Yeah.
Do you think the younger people are more educated and more prone, and that over the decades coming, that this will become easier?
Uh, yes, and the reason is what I'm seeing here in the region. The most active, the young people, if they get into any kind of campaigning, are going to go into climate change for all the understandable reasons. So we got climate change groups in high schools now, around Montana and the like. There has been a dropping off of activists oriented to specific species, wolves and bears. You get the large number of animal watchers who are incredibly supportive, but they're not necessarily hooked into what can I do to help, But young people are generally more tolerant, and you are seeing, even in the ranching community, one of the kind of amazing and fun things that I've had an opportunity to see are the kids of ranch families who want to do things differently in terms of really managing for storing carbon in how they manage their grasslands, really managing for coexisting with other species, prairie dogs and bears and the like. These are the grandkids of the people who killed off the last wolves, so you are seeing kind of a flip in the younger generation of some of these ranch families. And eventually, I'm not seeing it affecting what is happening in the steakhouse in Montana, for example, because the Montana steakhouse is so off the beam in terms of ultra right, hostile. I mean, I don't think the young generation has been able to get a toehold, but they will. We're seeing more young people running for office. A young Native American man did and succeeded. So I think in the long run, these kids are smart, they're educated, they're tolerant of the other, whether you consider the other to be brown people or whether the other is a grizzly bear. They're tolerant of animals and people who are not like them. So I think that's an incredibly promising sign.
There's an independent journalist named Peter Santanello who goes around the country to different neighborhoods, to different communities, rural and whatnot. And he did a series of interviews with young people. Was it Wyoming? I think it was in Wyoming, who were young ranchers taking over, or some of them were people who took or bought ranches and are trying these new ways. Do you think that one of the reasons, just on a political realpolitik kind of way, that a lot of these ranchers still have this manifest destiny thing is they see people like the Treadwells, or they see people like that Julia Butterfly Hill, who spent a year and a half up in a tree doing these stunts, and they think and they're like, oh, these people, they don't really care, they just want to get famous and have their face on a movie or a documentary or whatever. Do you think that some of the younger people who are taking over these ranches, though, will be able to be more effective than sort of this stunt kind of thing to bring attention to things? Because even though they may be right, oftentimes it's off-putting because it does seem like just a stunt.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And one of the things that I've seen, and the environmental community is really guilty of this, is it's comfortable now. I mean, when I started back in the day, there weren't that many people who would call themselves activists. And I got in my little car and I drove around the ecosystem and I talked to ranchers and I showed up at their kitchens and I said, hey, how are you getting along with grizzly bears? And one of the problem with the movement is there's a lot of money in environmentalism now. And I would argue that there are very few groups that are very effective, either because they're invisible. They're hanging out in their office, having beers with each other, and they're not going out to where the action is on the ground in communities where there is a lot of killing going on. Or they are, by where they're from and the way they speak, seen as culturally different. Not from elitists from the East, for example.
Well, years ago in New York, they were called limousine liberals. People who would have the right ideas, but they were so secluded they didn't actually live in the trenches.
Yes, right. And so that's what I see. Some of the loggers and ranchers taking exception to is these are not like me. I mean, these are trust funds. What the heck?
Yeah.
And so, I mean,
but it's harder to be that way if you've lived that life and now your grandson is telling you, Gramps, we got to change.
Got to change. And I've seen that. There's several big ranch families not far from here who are totally changing the way. I mean, the grandmother's like, well, I still keep the books, but the grandkid is saying, no, this is never going to do it though. And so it's changing, and family by family, and that's the most heartening thing. But I think another problem is that, and it's a social media, it's a media problem, where it's easy to stereotype the other because of what you see in the press or what you see in social media. And the only antidote to that, there's only one, and that is getting out of your comfort zone and talking to people. So some of the biggest progress on coexistence with grizzly bears is happening at a very small scale in communities. Like there's a drainage not far from here where there's a lot of grizzly bears, and these ranchers have really gotten it together. I mean, they're really setting an incredible example. And they meet with each other and they meet with environmentalists and they say, here's what we're doing, here's what we need. And it's working out quite well, but it's because it's very, it's focused on some challenges and it's dealing with people who have had, at this point, long-term relationships. There's no replacement for that. Social media is kind of driving us apart rather than, bringing us together in this way.
I lived in Minnesota in the end of the 20th century, and there were a lot of hunters there. That's a very hunting-based culture in Minnesota,
Right.
which is considered liberal. And a lot of those hunters were like, well, I paid for my license. I'm doing things legally, and they would be demonized as being bloodthirsty savages along with the poachers. But it's like,
Yeah.
they're playing by the rules, and if they don't kill them, there's going to be no one. You're going to have deer running wild. So it seems like a lot of people can't differentiate from the bad poaching and necessary culling when needed.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, one of the there's a lot of hunters who are pro grizzly bear, tons of them. I mean, it's like, look, I go out to hunt, but I go out to see wildlife, and it actually makes it more exciting to know that there's a grizzly bear around. It's like you're more awake. And so the issue here is you're dividing the poachers from hunters, but the other divide in the hunting community are the trophy hunters and the folks who are trying to fill their freezer.
Yeah.
That is a huge divide. You're finding more and more, even among the hunting community, saying, trophy hunting grizzlies is just not sporting. The Indians are saying, I don't want you to put my grandmother's head on the wall because of their connection with grizzly bears. And the hunting community is even saying, that's disgusting. If you're going to kill something, you have an obligation to make use of it, and not just selling the gallbladder, but make use of the meat. And what they're talking about, nobody eats grizzly bear meat. That's all trophy hunting. So there's a conversation that's been going on for a long time with the hunting community about, we're on the same side on this. We're talking about trophy hunting grizzly bears, and we're totally pro, your ability to hunt an elk, And so again, it gets back to how do you break down stereotypes.
Is there anything before we wrap up that I haven't discussed that you want to bring up?
I want to bring up Romania. Only because Romania, and of course it's relevant to this war that's going on, but in Romania, they have a brown bear population that is like 7,000 brown bears, mostly in the Carpathians, the borders, Poland and Ukraine and stuff. And they have a human population that has the density of Appalachia in this country. So hugely dense human population with a hugely dense grizzly bear population. Not that many resources for conflict resolution. They have a Carpathian bear dog, which is a really badass guard dog. But there has never been a cultural break. The Romanian culture and grizzly bears have lived together cheek by jowl for thousands and thousands of years. We lose track of that when we say, we're going to get to
are they grizzlies or are they brown bears?
They're the same species.
Okay.
It's Ursus arctos. And yes, people do get killed. But it's an attitude. It's what is between your ears that matters. They've never not had grizzlies. You're not talking about reintroducing them like we did with wolves. You're talking about an animal that's lived here. Yes, the food sources are very high, beech forests, and acorns and the like. But people and sheep, there are millions of sheep in Romania. And they've got these badass guard dogs, and they don't have a lot of guns. People don't have a lot of guns, and so shooting them isn't really an option. And they've learned to coexist. I mean, I think we should be looking to countries like, Romania, that's kind of got this unbroken connection. Because I think what our frontier past did to us is it severed a long-standing connection that natives had with bears and large carnivores. And we are only just relearning this, painfully, with the help of the Endangered Species Act. And I think there's other examples. Sweden has several thousand, brown bears. Italy still does. Greece still does. It's like, what can we learn from Siberia, Russia? What can we learn from these other cultures? We seem to think, we're in the U.S. We know all about, bear management and all, wildlife recovery. It's like, I don't think so. I think we need some humility, not just around bears, but around what success can look like.
Well, I will link to the Grizzly Times below this video. Anyone wanting to find out more about your paper and yourself can click there. I want to thank you for spending over an hour speaking with me, Louisa.
So thanks, Dan. It's been great to be with you. I hope I didn't chew your ear off.